John is the Director of Community and Political Engagement at Just Cities. He's a father of three and a third-generation East Oaklander, and he's a formerly incarcerated advocate seeking to transform his community. After a prolonged period of being unsheltered and unemployed, John became involved in working on the local, county, and state levels on campaigns and ballot measures to advance affordable housing, create employment opportunities, end mass incarceration, and bring police accountability and racial equity to Oakland. John also authored a standout article for the Oaklandside back in January, in which he contextualized Oakland's spiking gun violence this year by drawing on his own personal experiences growing up in East Oakland. John, it's so good to see you.
Thank you, Jacob. It's good to see you, and it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For you, what's driving the violence?
Yes, I think it's always important when we talk about gun violence is to understand the multitude of factors that contribute to it. Things like socioeconomic conditions, easy access to firearms, even the impact on the underground economy. With shelter in place, certain jobs were deemed to, continue, and then some wasn't. And that also contributed to, a ripple effect on the underground economy, as it were. What I was seeing happening during COVID was eerily reminiscent of what happened during the crack cocaine epidemic. But I think there's two additional things. The advent of both social media and just the impact and influence of hip hop music, for example. Something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. But when we understand that these things are geared toward young people whose brains are not fully developed, and this is what they look to for guidance, where they get their values from. So when I came of age, we didn't glorify drug use. That was something we frowned upon. Yes, we sold drugs, but to personally use it, that was considered a no-no. Today, everything is considered fair game, and that's also having an impact as it relates to poor decision making. Usually when people talk about mental health, it's usually through the extreme of, like, for example, seeing someone walking down the street talking to themselves. For me, I like to elevate the role and impact of PT. So once again, if we're in a situation to where there's dire financial situations, it's going to affect you emotionally, mentally, right? And then if you're self-medicating, something I also pointed out that will increase, and sadly it did. Like last year, for example, we had a record number of drug overdose deaths. All these different factors create this, they converge, they create conditions for violence.
You mentioned PTSD just now, and I wanted to actually talk to you about that because it's something that you're personally familiar with, and one of the things that you did share in your piece was actually a series of events that you experienced as a young person, a very young person, a series of violent events, including being shot at for the first time, physical encounters with police officers, being attacked by other young people, right? And I wanted to kind of come back to that and just ask you, thinking back on that first time that you were shot at, how did that moment change you?
Classic textbook definition of PTSD. Prior, I was a straight A student, someone that was academically bright, skipped from the first to third grade. So here I am, all of 12 years old, walking down the street and with my two older cousins, and when a group of three young people decided to shoot at us, I was in shock. And it took me some time to even process what was happening. But the end result, Jacob, was an understanding for me, at least in that moment, that in order for me to survive, the increase in how East Oakland has become increasingly dangerous, and I had to adopt a similar type of mentality, a willingness to survive at all costs, by all means. Which was easy to do, once again, when I realized how easy it was to get a gun. I think it was like $30. First gun I ever bought, 13 years old. It was so easy. But there's also other things too. And I think one of the things I do want to lift up as a result is there's these unwritten rules in Oakland, for example. You must retaliate. Because it's not just about the people that you have an issue with. It's also about your circle. Because, people want to make sure that everybody in your group is capable of defending themselves and defending each other. So a lot of times violence occurs not because people are innately heinous or anything like that. It's peer pressure. It's wanting to fit in. It's wanting to survive because it's easier to survive with a group of friends than it is to try to do so by yourself.
What do you say now as an advocate, right, to young people that are out there in the streets that are in similar situations that you faced, who are dealing with that, who are trapped in that cycle of violence, where it is about survival? It doesn't feel like a choice.
So I think it's important to start with by not treating young people as an outlier. It's something I experienced with my oldest son. What I mean by that is, we say all the right things as parents. Don't do this, don't fight. But they're struggling, trying to come of age, they're struggling with what is the concept of masculinity? It means something totally different in the street. Once again, these unwritten rules. Telling your kid, don't do this, this, and this, but then they're ostracized by their peers. And equally important, if not more important, then they become a target themselves, because there's like a hierarchy, a social hierarchy as it relates to violence as well. So for me, the advice I always give is I always tell young people, do a couple of things. It starts with who you hang with. You can be hanging with the wrong person and become a homicide victim. You have to change your circles, because you can't change your thinking if people in your circle has that same type of thing. It's occupying your time. And above all, is having a sense of belief. And that's the hardest thing, because once again, we're talking with young people whose brains are not fully developed. So you and I, Jacob, as full adults, right? We have the privilege of looking back and saying, oh, this is the right thing to do. Or, yeah, go to school, get an education. But when you're in that situation and that's not a value that's always shared in your peer set, then it makes it difficult to break out of that. So I think the main thing, Jacob, is just trying to encourage people to be proactive in their thinking, less reactive, because 95% of acts of violence are really reactive, right? In the moment, heightened emotions. If you couple substance abuse, trauma, all these things, you're reacting to something in a moment that really could be decades or years in the making. And at the end of the day, I say this too, a lot of people are serving for a 10 to 15-second mistake that they wish they can take back.
There are some folks who say violence isn't going to end until we get the guns off the streets. And there are programs in Oakland and in other places, like gun buyback programs, where community members are incentives are created so that folks will bring their guns and turn them into the police. And then there's a perspective that says we're never going to get the guns out of the community. And that actually the focus should really be on teaching people that violence is not the solution to their problems, right? And I'm just curious where you come down on that.
I definitely agree, Jacob, with the latter. To me, it's challenging when people say, oh, if you get rid of the guns, then that we end the violence. No, we got to focus on ending the conditions. And part of those conditions is how it's so easy for folks to want to retaliate. Because once again, we're talking about a culture, unwritten rules that we must disrupt. Trying to criminalize or stop guns, that's not the issue. It's how do we get people to not see guns as an option? And that, once again, is not only the larger question, but it's the most difficult one. Because again, if there's 10 people feuding and one person say, I'm going to put my gun down, then if the other 9 people don't do that, then that one person, is now vulnerable. So I think it requires a deeper conversation that's really rooted in the lived-in experiences of people who feel the need to carry a gun right now.
There's a growing chorus of voices that are calling for a reimagining of how police are implemented to increase safety in the community. There are folks calling to drastically reduce police budgets. Is there a place for traditional policing, right, as part of the solution to really reduce violence in the community? Or does it really just need to come from within?
I think this is a situation that we have to go deeper, because quite frankly, that has not happened with the reimagining process. Honestly, it's been a hyper focusing on law enforcement. I think that's the first mistake, because yes, police is reactive. Yes, we do spend too much money disproportionately on policing. The reality is we need to address these issues on the front end. So for me, Jacob, I look at what's ideal and what's real. It's ideal to say, yeah, let's reduce the budget by 50%. But that's not what's real as far as what's happening in a community like East Oakland. And when people say we are safe, then people need to really do that. It's too much talking points and semantics. I think the best solution does come from community, when we can transform the hood back into a neighborhood, a place where you actually know your neighbors. I'm old enough, Jacob, to remember East Oakland in the late 70s and early 80s, when it was a real sense of community, where, everyone in the community held us accountable as young kids. We knew each other, but crack and the resulting violence disrupted that social networking fabric to where people live in fear. We don't know one another. And the second thing is I always talk about historical context and institutional memory. I always reminded people in the 80s and 90s, it was Black and brown residents who were ushering the call for more police. People want to feel safe. And what I've been hearing is this, two things as it relates to the police from East Oakland residents. They want the police, number one, to stop killing and abusing us. Number two, they want them to do their jobs. So the breakdown becomes a matter of philosophy, right? Or ideology. You know, for example, if you're abolitionist, then in your worldview, there is not a role for police. And that's not real. That's ideal. That's, optimistic. That sounds good, but that's not where we at. We have to do a better job of improving both the homicide solve rate and holding folks accountable. Now, it's a different conversation on what punishment looks like, but here's the reality, because that serves as a deterrent to violence. In other words, if someone is accused of killing someone and someone in the streets know that, then they're going to retaliate. I mean, they're going to go after family members. The 1-year-old that was burnt to death in that house, the 1-year-old girl with her father, that's a result of retaliatory violence because the person didn't turn themselves in. And then ultimately, when they did so, then the violence stopped. So that is a real deterrent. So in other words, we got to look at the entirety of the picture as opposed to low-hanging fruit. Because again, after reimagining public safety task force, to me, folks were only focusing on mental health, right? Or they were focused on how do we just get rid of the police. If I can say this last thing, I think this is the key to how we get there. Because like I say, I agree with a lot of people in principle. Where I disagree with is the strategy. And it involves two things. The first is censoring those who live in these communities most impacted by crime and violence. Because it's too much privilege, to be quite frank. People are speaking on things that they don't see in their own community. It's like when we brought up gun violence, people didn't want to have that conversation because they view that as a threat to the goal of the police, which tells me they don't have an answer for gun violence. So they don't have an answer for it, they're unwilling to talk about it. And if you're unwilling to talk about it, then you already create a clear division between those efforts and everyday folks in East Oakland, right? So that's important. And then the second thing is, once again, how do we build power? It has to be from the ground up. It's an all hands on deck situation, Jacob. If we're talking about public safety, then it can't just be repurposing the police, because I feel like that's a real conversation. Like, we're not talking about public safety. To me, public safety involves sex trafficking, pedestrian and traffic safety issues. I mean, people are being killed by cars, hit and run drivers.
I'm wishing you all the best in Atlanta. Really quickly, I just wanted to give you a chance to speak on that. You did recently relocate your family to Atlanta, and it kind of does play into the conversation we're having right now about Oakland and how it's changing.
To be clear, my family has lived down here for 20 years, so there was always a thought, a conversation. Then when COVID came, it just really hit home for me as a single father, family unification. But as I seen the rise in violence, and I think this is important, Jacob, when we talk about the institutional memory. For someone like me, we've been through this. It wasn't a 1-year aberration. Like, people was writing off last year as, oh, that's just COVID. I'm like, no, we've been here before, and this is not going away anytime soon. East Oakland today looks worse. The conditions look worse than it did during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. We didn't have thousands of people unsheltered. We didn't have proliferation of illegal dumping, And what's happening now, and even with the violence in particular, because violence historically used to be, a matter of, for the most part, you knew one turf was beefing with another turf. So we knew that. So you knew, okay, stay away from over there. To be honest, some of the stuff is sporadic. You can't really attribute it to a single thing. There's some things you can, because the streets, we hear everything. But some of these things, a 60-year-old man shot to death at a bus stop, that's not part of a gang initiation or a drug trade. Like, who's doing this? And I suspect there's people outside the community as well. But I say that for another day. But long story short, Jacob, for me, I want to get somewhere where my son plays outside. There's no fear of gunshots. Only thing we hear is birds chirping. And for me, this is a quality of life issue. That's something that people have to center. It's not just about having a roof over your head, Jacob. What's the quality of life? The high rent for what? To step over human feces? To not have access to supermarkets with healthy food? Or what's the alternatives as it relates to entertainment? For example, having a 19-year-old. When I was growing up in East Oakland, Jacob, we had 3 movie theaters, a bowling alley, a skating ring. There was things to do, in other words. You have to literally leave East Oakland, where you feel safe at, just to go to a movie theater. When people talk about displacement of Black people, specifically in Oakland, a lot of people attribute that to the increase in rents. That's not historically accurate. Black people began to out-migrate during the 1990s. Actually, during the 1980s. I had friends that was more affluent. You know, their parents own a home, so they have the privilege to move outside. Why? Because once again, the violence. No one is safe. Elders, children. We just had a 15-year-old boy murdered in East Oakland. 15 years old. And when people in the community hear the silence on these issues, it shows that no one cares about us. But it also sent a message, Jacob, to the young people who carry guns. If their lives don't matter, then how can we expect them to value the life of someone else? We have to change the paradigm. We have to change our approach. And part of that is the willingness and the courage to talk about these issues. Because that conversation, a deep dive, will lead to some real solutions, because there are some real solutions. But we can't implement that if folks are unwilling to even have the conversation.